Everybody see it okay? Yeah, okay. And while we start, it would be great if in the chat you can just type your name, what you do and who you're working for, and whereabouts in the world you are. And then, as we're quite a small group, what we'll do is we'll be having some Q&A during our time, and so we will do that naturally as a group. So yeah, so welcome to the ARAC conference. I hope that you've enjoyed the last 2 days, 2.5 days. This is our 4th conference. Our first 2 years were in person in Bangkok, and then obviously when COVID hit, we went online. So this is our 2nd online conference. So we're delighted to have you join. So this is the Butterfly Longitudinal Research session, which has been carried out by Chab Dai and our amazing partners such as Glenn Miles. Oh, I am going to try and make sure that, there we are, okay. Right, so this is just going to be the outline. We have an hour and a half today, so this is our outline for the day. So I'm going to start us off in a minute with our background and why do longitudinal research. Then Glenn is going to dig into the detail of the research outline, methodology and limitations. And we're going to take this in kind of like small, what I call TED Talk chunks. So we're going to be, Glenn and I are going to be sharing for about 15 minutes. And then after each session, we're going to have a 10-minute or 15-minute Q&A. Rather than, you know, speak for like 40 minutes where everybody has got so much information, it's hard to remember what questions to ask, right? Then Glenn is going to dig into the research summary outcomes. Of course, these are summary, the research spread over 10 years. And then we're going to be having another Q&A session. And then the next piece is going to be around replication. And we hope that this is going to be where it really hits home for you in your countries. So I'm going to talk a little bit about global interest levels. And then Glenn, the last piece of research, main piece of research for Butterfly was the research on the research or the research of the research. So really looking at what happened within the research process. And the primary reason for this is so that there could be replication of this research around the world. And then we'll finish up with another session of Q&A. So me first. So a bit of a background on this. If for those of you who don't know, I'm Helen Sworn. I'm the founder and executive director of Chab Dai. Chab Dai in the Cambodian language means joining hands. And in 2005, I founded the organization as a coalition. And a number of our coalition members run aftercare shelters. And there was a lot of shelters that had started up between 2003, after 2003, because there was a huge kind of focus on Cambodia and specifically the sex trafficking issues in Cambodia at that time. So there were lots of NGOs and individuals who came to set up aftercare shelters during that time. And so at that time, we didn't know a huge amount around human trafficking, nothing like we know now, right? And so lots of people set up shelters, but really not understanding the kind of the long-term piece, because a lot of people were focused on rescue. What we need is rescue, and rescue will take them out of that situation. Many of the initiatives at that time were very short-term focused. The funding cycles were very short-term focused and still are primarily. And so what we were doing is we were looking at some different pieces of other research in the first few years of establishing Chab Dai. And I came across a piece of research that basically tracked the life of this woman who had been commercially, sexually exploited and trafficked. And it looked at her, her rescue, then how she ended up in an aftercare shelter, or a safe house, some would call, for a number of years, received a lot of services during that time. Then she was doing very well, and her case was closed off. She went back to the community, and she managed to get a job. It looks like, honestly, for any of us who would be caseworkers, it's like, yeah, she's done well. She's back in the community. She's in a relationship. She's got a husband. And then after a while, people found out what her background was. And the stigma within her community grew around her. The women would shun her, the men would proposition her. And so her and her husband moved to another place. And this happened again. And eventually, 5 years after she exited that program, that woman took her own life. And so it made me realize that, you know, for most of the aftercare providers, you know, there is only the resources to follow up maybe for a year or 2 years. We actually don't know what happens after then. So we're designing all of our responses and our programs based on this much information, a small piece of information, rather than the whole spectrum of what happens to them when they go back into the community. So we got the aftercare shelters around the table and said, why don't we do a piece of research that looks at 10 years of the life of somebody who is a survivor of sex trafficking in Cambodia. And that process, just to let you know, took quite a long time in getting people around the table, getting them to understand that this isn't about, you know, critiquing, evaluating their programs. This is about understanding the life cycle of a survivor after exploitation. This wasn't for us to go back into their stories and dig into what happened to them. It was looking from now, what are your hopes and fears and what's going to take you into the future? So after almost 2 years discussion, we managed to find a donor who said, well, maybe I'll fund the first year or two. And frankly, for the next 10 years, it was a bit like that. Oh, we'll find somebody to fund another year or another year. But, and a lot of people said, you can't do 10 years. You can't do 10 years. The rationale is, we all know that trafficking is not going to be going away tomorrow. We cannot develop a program that is going to end it at the end of 2021. And we need longitudinal understanding for developing our programs. And this is going to only come from longitudinal research. So that's a bit of the background. And I am going to pass this to Glenn, who is now going to focus on the outline methodology. If you just give me a thumbs up, Glenn, when you want me to change the slide.
Okay, thanks, Helen. So we're just going to have a quick scan through. It really is very. It's just some thoughts and ideas, but let's have a go. Okay, next one, Helen. So it began in 2010, and at that time we managed to recruit 128 survivors from 15 NGOs. In 2010, that meant that there were 13 shelters and 2 community-based programs. And by 2019, there was a high level of programmatic diversification. So there were 7 shelter programs, 8 community-based programs, and 3 vocational trainings programs. So far, there's been 13 publications, and there's 7 more expected by September 2020. These are peer review journal articles. So, but something that you really need to understand is that this research, what makes it different is it's come primarily from the NGO sector. It's not come from the academic sector. So even though these we've now developed research which is appropriate for the academic sector, the actual initiative has come from NGOs, and the way that it's been driven has also been NGOs. So we've constantly going back to the NGOs to ask them what they want to do, and then based on that. So the core objectives is to actively engage a single cohort of survivors of exploitation over a 10-year period about their life experiences, challenges, and perceptions toward service providers, to facilitate roundtable discussions with NGO forums and workshops with anti-trafficking partners and stakeholders on findings, themes, and recommendations, and then to disseminate the findings of the publications to global, regional, and local audience of practitioners, programs, policymakers, government bodies, and academics. So the ethical protocols were quite intense. We had a Ministry of Health National Research Ethics Committee annual review, and then we made sure that in listening to the participants, we could pass them on to any services from NGO partners. We felt that that was important. We couldn't just, if they told us stuff that was of concern, then we didn't just abandon them, but we actually referred them on. It was completely voluntary participation. There was no monetary incentives. Participants were willing to answer or not answer any contact or questions of the project. They were completely able to decide whether they wanted to answer questions or not. And then the confidentiality was there's no pictures and media involved in the process. The data was carefully managed, all the interviews were secure, and researchers were never alone with the participants. So there's a lot more detail, but we need to move on. So that gives you an idea anyway. So the selection criteria was that they had experienced sex trafficking defined in the UN's 2000 Palermo Protocol. And then they were from and reintegration back to the five main provinces throughout Cambodia. In fact, that we didn't continue with that. We decided that we would just that because some of them were ending up traveling back to different provinces, so we opened that up to the whole country. Sorry, can you go back? And then it was also from NGOs who agreed to sign MOUs with the Butterfly Project that work in aftercare for human trafficking survivors. So that was really important, and it took a long time because we had different MOUs for each NGO that we worked with. Okay, next one, please. So I won't go into detail with this, but you just look at the top left-hand corner, you can see that 71% of the original 128 remain active in the study at the end of the project. So that was 70% of the boys and 68% of the girls. That's pretty incredible when you think about how challenging it is to keep contact with people in a very complicated and complex environment. And a number of them had legitimate reasons for not participating. But one of the challenges was the stigma of being associated with anti-trafficking NGOs, and some were fleeing debt and moved out of the country, chronic illness, drug addiction, and suicide. So there were lots of reasons why they couldn't continue, but the majority did. Next, please. So the majority of what I'm going to be sharing with you now was with 52 longitudinal participants out of that 128. And the reason why it's 52 is because they responded to the survey questions in years 2012, 2013, 2017, and 2018, which means that we can make some comparisons over time. Next, please. So this is a quantitative summary of the data that's been collected. The limitations was that this presentation cannot represent all sexually exploited individuals in Cambodia, not even the original 128 participants, and all of the experience it cannot represent all of the experiences recorded through the 10-year project, but it can show some patterns that help us to consider how we can improve policy and programming. To benefit the most from this research, it's necessary for all stakeholders to read through the publications. And so all the currently the reports that were given available, summaries in Cambodian and in English, are available on our website. So it's www.chabdai.org/butterfly. And we're currently in the process of getting these findings into the peer-reviewed journal articles with what's known as Dignity, which is a journal a reputable journal which focuses on sexual exploitation and sexual violence and other forms of violence. Okay, next one, please. So just to understand the demographics, so you can understand who we're talking about. Next, please, Helen. So 11 of this group were male and 41 were female. So we did have men or young boys at the beginning involved in this. Next one, please. And you can see there the ages at 2012. So the blue ones represent the boys. So you can see most of them were under, they were boys rather than men. And then the female was a much broader age range, but the peaking at 15 to 20. Next one, please. And so you can see by 2018 that these were the ages that it had moved up to. Okay, and next one, please. Okay, so have you got any questions at this point? We'd be grateful if you would ask questions to the group. So if you do want to ask a question, please can you unmute yourself and then ask the question, and we'll see if we can go from there. If you're not comfortable with speaking, you can put your questions in the comments, and Helen will make a note and then ask it, if that's all right, Helen. Okay, so is there anyone that's got a question?
Hello, Glenn. This is Mike Fenema, working with World Renew in Laos. It's been a long time since we met.
It has been a long time.
A quick question, if you can just go back one slide. I was just noticing, it's a small thing, but because you compared 2012 and 2018, but it didn't make, I was unclear, because how could somebody be 14 years old in 2018 if they were involved in the 2012 data set?
Because they were 6, 7 years old.
Oh, okay. Also less than 12. Okay, so boys, some were very young then. Wow.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thanks.
No, that's fine. Nice to see you, mate.
Yeah, likewise.
Oops. Excuse my dog.
Okay, so we've got one question in the chat. If the community part of the problem when they receive victims, how does this research contribute to changing the mindset of the community if part of the problem is the community when they receive the victims?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things about this that we need to bear in mind is that even though our recommendations are primarily to organizations about how they can change what they're doing, actually, of course, you're quite right that it's the community and society and national level things need to change as well. And we can make recommendations to the government and to local local organizations, local government, because yeah, things like stigma are a big part of that. Chab Dai itself have got programs, and I know that there are other organizations as well that trying to at least make a difference in the community understanding that really it is really unhelpful to be stigmatizing those who are themselves victims. But yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Did I answer that, or did you have a further question on that? Okay. Anyone else?
If there's no more questions on this session, we can always move to the next bit, and then we can have other questions afterwards. So, I'll allow a couple more minutes. Any other questions, anybody? If not, we'll just move to the next slide. No. Okay. We're going to move to the next section now. So here we go. This is the research outcomes and lessons learned. Over to you again, Glenn.
Okay, good. So yeah, as Helen said, you can't really summarize 10 years of data in in 15 minutes, but we'll have a go and give you some of the lessons. And I've also got some other lessons that I can add on the end if we've got time. So next one, please, Helen. So one of the challenges we had was in terms of ethnicity, was about truth. Now, the thing is that when you're doing longitudinal research, it is different than taking a snapshot, and most research is done as a snapshot. When you do research over a period of time, you realize that actually what people say can change. One of the things that we found that a change was ethnicity. So we found that that actually people were saying, even though we would ask the same question and people were saying that they had different ethnicity over time. Well, that's obviously sounds a bit odd, but then when we tried to unpack it, we realized that, for example, it's advantageous for people to say that they're Cambodian if they have Vietnamese ethnicity in Cambodia, because the Vietnamese in Cambodia have traditionally been enemies. And so if, for example, you marry somebody who's Cambodian and you're Vietnamese ethnic, then it's better for you to just say, well, I'm Cambodian. So does that make sense? So this, but what this also said to us is that those who have been involved in doing the research, they, over time, they were trusting the researchers more and more, and so it was really important that trust did develop, and I think it showed how impressive the researchers were, that they managed to get them to really tell them what effectively the truth was. Another aspect of ethnicity was that those that were on the fringes and didn't necessarily have the right documents were definitely disadvantaged, and it showed us how important it is for organizations to help people to get ID documents, for example. Okay, next one. So this just shows you some of how it changed over time. Okay, next one. And next, another aspect of telling truth over time was, due to the researchers' ethical protocols and scope of study, we didn't start asking them questions about what had happened to them until well after the incidents had happened. But we did find that a number of them in the end actually hadn't been sexually exploited. Now, it takes some time to explain this, but basically we're working in a context where different organizations, it was to their advantage that they said that those who were in their programs had actually been sexually exploited. And so even though we went to some lengths to talk to ensure that those at the beginning, to ensure that that when we asked the participants themselves whether they'd been sexually exploited, they said that they had. And so a number of participants were ruled out and asked that, and we realized that they couldn't be part of the project. But over time, when they started to open up about the experiences that they'd had, a number of them said that they hadn't been sexually exploited at all. So that was quite revealing. But some of them were in very, very vulnerable situations. For example, it may have been a sister of somebody who had been sexually exploited and would likely have been exploited. So we still continue to follow their progress. So prevention efforts need to stay up to date with current trends to remain relevant to their programming. Okay, next, please. So you can see here that in this particular group, that 27 had been sexually exploited, 18 were high risk, and 6 had experienced rape. Okay, next, please. So regarding health, we know that poverty and sexual violence have long-term impacts on both physical and emotional health and vulnerabilities. So we need organizations to be aware that programming should anticipate physical and emotional needs over the long term to ensure sustained health. There needs to be consideration, particularly of mental health issues due to trauma. And so we know that as time has gone on, organizations have been much better at including trauma based support and therapy in the actual programs themselves. But that's something which definitely has been confirmed by our research. Next one, please. So you can see here, this is how they this was the difference between men and female about their physical health. And in the early stages, you can see the boys were, I think they were overwhelmingly responded that they were feeling better, but that may have been because they had gone from being in a very exploitive situation to being in a shelter where their lives have been improved. And then the next slide shows later on, you know, this is now 6 years later, and the situation for them had become a lot worse for many of them as well, and not really significant differences between the male and female group. Okay, next, please. Next, Helen. Are we stuck?
Yeah, no, this is emotional health now, Glenn. I switched
Oh, sorry, emotional health. Yes, thank you. So this is, yeah, this is before they're feeling a lot better. They seem to be better, but then next one, over time, feeling a kind of mixture between worse and better. So it just shows that it was variable, but we did have 5 participants disclose suicidal ideations over the years as well, and one of those did commit suicide. Okay, next one, please. Sexual health. Well, one of the lessons that we learned in this was that for a lot of the participants, they went on to have abortions, and so contraception education needs to be a vital part of aftercare programming. Women should be informed about programs that offer care to expectant mothers, and women, obviously the misunderstandings that they have around contraceptive must be addressed. My concern is that with Christian faith-based organizations, that people don't want to talk about the issue of, they don't want to talk about abortions, but women do need to be informed about the legal situation that abortions can be performed up to 12 weeks and after 12 weeks in case of rape or when women's life is at risk. And this is to avoid women seeking dangerous and illegal abortions outside of professional care. We're not recommending abortions. We're saying that we want to save women's lives and we want to help to protect them. So that was what we felt was important. Okay, next. So you can see here, these a termination is kind of almost the method in which is used more than other methods, and we had just the pill and diaphragm. The rest that were actually using some kind of contraception, but withdrawal and natural cycle are not high risk to unwanted pregnancy. Next, please. And then 2018, 16 out of the 39% of them had abortions. So this was after they'd left the over the time of the program. Okay, next one, please. So sexual health education should be a vital part of aftercare programming equally for boys and men, women and girls. While it's understood that women cannot control sexual activity of their partners, they need to be aware of how to use condoms to protect themselves where possible. And that includes long-term partnerships as well. When symptoms occur, they need to understand the importance of seeking medical help early for treatment so that complications are minimized. Okay, next, please. So you can see here, this was self-reported in 2018. You've got 21% saying that they reported difficult, painful urination in the past 6 months, and then 15 to 7, that was 15.7%. So said that they had penile or vaginal discharge. So that's really, again, I think it's probably because Christian organizations haven't considered that in part of their training outcomes for aftercare. Next one, please. Another lesson that we learned is about justice. Most of the children didn't get justice for crimes committed against them, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime identified that corruption can be linked to various stages of trafficking, from forging documents during recruitment through bribery of immigration officials, law enforcement and judiciary. So I'm sure that many of you are in that same situation as well. The legal process is lengthy and police often difficult. Children need educating. So I mean, so really doing court reform, the way that this whole process happens, we need to be more vigilant and advocating for. For example, children need educating in preparation for the court process, but the court itself need to be more child-centered. We need to rearrange a structure so victims are not re-victimized. We need better confidentiality, and victims shouldn't have to be cross-examined. That's inappropriate. So compensation was ordered but not given in 20 cases. So even when it had been ordered, they weren't getting it. So we felt like a compensation scheme must be developed. So those are some of the recommendations just from that part, but very difficult. And this was the part of the study that the participants found hardest to talk about. So, and again, I don't think that would have happened. We wouldn't have been able to get the responses from them if we didn't have great relationship between the researchers and the participants. Okay, next one, please. Education. Completing grade 9 education is absolutely fundamental for anyone for basically for children to then go on and do something else. Even vocational training programs now are requiring grade 9 or equivalent completion. So if you don't have grade 9, it really disadvantages to you. Grade 9 education is a right under the Constitution of Cambodia. So aftercare programs should consider long-term requirements of their clients achieving a higher education if they can do it. But I think we also need to encourage market-driven and accredited vocational training rather than organizations themselves trying to do some kind of vocational training on the premises. So what we're saying here is that they need to, the children in their care need to have up to grade 9 education. So getting them out into schools, getting them to have up to grade 9. If they've lost time because they've been, for example, they've been unable to do school during the period of time, then that they've been sexually exploited, then we need to think about catch-up ways so that they can catch up to the grade that they need, that they can get help in. And vocational training, much better for it to be something that's outside of the organization, which also can help in their their reintegrating back into the community as well. So thinking about that. Next one, please. So you can see here that in out of those different organizations, those in the Butterfly Project, not really that much different, that had received grade 9, completed grade 9, 35% and 31% of the average. So in terms of average sorry, I'll say it again. 31% is the average of children who've completed grade 9 in the public, in general, and 35% of Butterfly participants. So, I mean, you could say, well, that's good if you're comparing it because these children are often traumatized. But when you think the amount of time and effort that's been invested in them, it would be better for them to have for that figure to be higher. Next, please. So yeah, next, please. I think you can have a look at that later. Next, please. So spiritual health. So this was something I presented last year at the conference, and it was quite controversial. Some children took on Christianity as their faith, others remained Buddhist. Over time, some changed their mind and reverted to their traditional religion. Those who had a faith, what we found was that those who had a faith found it helped them in their healing journey and in their relationship with other people. So although concern has been expressed that participants felt forced, there was no evidence for that in the research. However, on returning to the community, some felt stigmatized by a family, community, and even churches. But we did find that those whose faith was an important part of their life, whether it was Christian or Buddhist, that they were felt better, and that it had helped them in their rehabilitation. 4 participants said that faith had prevented them from killing themselves, which is pretty impressive actually when you think about that, even if that's the only finding that we had from it. Okay, next, please. So the next one is about jobs. Aftercare programs should continue to provide career advice to clients, maybe even helping them to get work, especially alternative employment opportunities that are away from industries that are high risk for exploitation. It's really no point training participants to then become to work in equally exploitive industries. For example, the garment industry is often very exploitative. So employment opportunity resource should remain open to should be open to former clients over years after the formal reintegration services are complete. Vocational trainings and apprentices should ideally lead to employment outside the NGO community. Next one. So you can see here the main employments that they had. Interestingly, the highest was NGO. So somehow they managed to find themselves working within the NGO. But then although we had 8 who were working in the entertainment industry, only 2 of them were continuing to sell sex, or the ones that admitted to that. So actually, that is a good outcome. That at the end of the process, we still really only had 2 that were involved in sex work. Okay, next one, please. So this is monthly income levels, and you can see here $182 per month is the current salary for garment factory workers recommended by the government of Cambodia. But 16 out of 44 hadn't made that amount, and the lowest income was really very low indeed. It was just $18.5. But the average income was $204 a month. So that was slightly higher than the salary for garment factory workers. So that was a positive outcome. Okay, next, please. So the financial security is a concern. Aftercare programs should continue to provide financial literacy advice to clients, daily budgeting, including for rent, utilities, market buying and cooking, savings and debt management. These are crucial for people to survive who are struggling in poverty. These are the recommendations we make. And the next one, please. So you can see here the kind of amount of debt that that the participants had in 2018, going up to the highest amount of $12,000 was reported by 2 participants. 45 participants who reported having debt over 1,500, which is a huge amount in that context. And I think for many of them, they would feel pretty hopeless that they would never be able to get out of that debt. So they need help and support early on, before they get into this kind of debt, about how to do it. Okay, thanks, Helen. Okay, any questions? Helen, do you want to see, are there any questions in the...
Yeah, there's one, Anita, that's come in. Are there any homeschooling programs available for victims, survivors that can be used in multiple countries?
Sorry, what was the question again? Any
homeschooling programs available for victims or survivors that can be used in multiple countries? Anita, do you mean after exploitation?
Yes, no, I hear you. I think there have been some Christian programs that have been used in different contexts, but they focusing more on spirituality rather than the more general education. Yeah, I'm not aware of any. Are you, Helen?
I'm not actually. That's a really interesting question, Anita. I think for a lot of programs, what they try and do when it's safe is actually get them into the mainstream schooling system, not just for the education piece, but also for the socialization piece, because many of the survivors have not been in society for a while. And so I think that it's not just about the education, actually, it's about the socialization piece. So, so I think that would be my take on that. Okay, yes. Great, some others. Mike, do you have any information about the person who got into debt of the 1,500? Like 45% of those who got into debt for 1,500.
What do you mean by information, Mike?
Oh, just wondering the cause of how they ended up being so much in debt. Maybe there's some things.
I think that the challenge with debt is that if you have if it's by some unscrupulous money lender, as you would know, Mike, then it just accumulates and gets bigger and bigger very quickly without, even if the initial amount wasn't huge, it becomes big. So because you can't pay it back. So I can't tell you the reason why they got that much debt. It could be multiple reasons, really. Sorry.
Yeah.
No worries. Thanks.
We asked the question, did we, Glenn?
Sorry, what's that?
Yeah, I don't think we asked the question of what.
No, we didn't. No, that's right.
Historically, we know that a lot of it is around, taking care of family and sickness gets them into.
Yes, true.
Some recruitment, it depends how they got recruited. Sometimes they end up in debt bondage from the recruitment process, and some don't. Okay, John's got a question. Have the questions asked to participants changed over the years, Glenn? If so, what drove the revision and changes to those questions?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. So initially we had a kind of set of questions that we asked, and some of those questions were asked later on in the project. But one of the challenges that we found was that when we ask people questions, sometimes when we ask them when we asked later on, we weren't we weren't able to ask the same people. So people came and they asked, they might, like one year they might be available to ask all the questions, and the next year they weren't. So that's why we could only do the comparative data that we just shared with you. Many of those things were with just 52 participants, but some of the research that we did, we were able to do it with a larger amount. So also over the period of time doing the research, we had people asking, we went back to the organizations that were benefiting mostly from the research and said to them, what would you like to know about that would help you with your projects? And then they said, for example, we did research on stigma, or we did research on financial integrity, and then that would include things like the things that we just talked about. So so that means that, you know, for one particular year, we might focus a lot on that. So for example, after they'd all been reintegrated back into the community, we wanted to know what their experiences of the shelter that they'd been in. So that gave us information. So we could do it after they left the shelter, and we get much richer material then than we would do if they were still in the shelter. Does that make sense? So, you know, it just made sense to do it at different times to have to be able to ask the questions. So some of the questions we asked, we could make comparisons over time, but also we added new questions as the research progressed. So next question.
So the next question is, since sex education is considered as taboo in some countries in Asia, how effective is the program from the NGO?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but you know, some countries have been successful in doing sex education. For example, the government have been very in Thailand were very effective in promoting condom use, for example. So so they, you know, it depends on the willingness of the government, but also when it comes to NGOs, I think we just need to do it. You know, we're too pretty, and we're too, oh, we don't want to talk about this because it's embarrassing, and people don't like it, and it feels uncomfortable. I know that's all very well for me saying this as a white middle class man from the West, but you know, these are crucial topics, and if we don't deal with them, then we are going to end up with problems which has proved in this research, you know, where there's a higher number of abortions and where there's a significant amount of STDs. So we have to include that in it, in our programs, and we have to try and do that. And I believe that when in good programs where there's good relationship between the participants and the people organizing the programs, that's possible. We can break those taboos. Next, please.
So the next question, I'm happy to take this one, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but is this research work being used by other organizations to implement? I guess you're talking about implementing like program recommendations. If it's about implementing program recommendations, yes. It's been very interesting because, of course, we started the research and it was for Cambodia, about Cambodian survivors, to inform programs and policy in Cambodia initially, right? And then I can remember starting to have conversations with people in other parts of the world, especially when we started bringing out the more qualitative thematic papers, the ones like Glenn was talking about stigma, about filial piety and financial anxiety, about shelter experiences, and being contacted by lots of organizations in like Africa and other parts of the world saying, oh my gosh, this is just like in an African context. I'm like, really? They said, yeah, you know, similar like financial anxiety and stigma issues. And so in fact, its reach in terms of being used by other organizations has become global. We've seen, you know, health professionals pick it up, and and use it in a certain context. Aftercare providers pick it up and use it in a certain context. So we have actually, and probably we don't know the half of how organizations have implemented it, because it's, you know, always open access. Everything that we do is open access. So people are available, you know, are able to just download it and use it however is the most beneficial for their context, their programs, their nation. So if that was the question that you were asking, anything to add to that, Glenn?
You know, I think you're right, Helen. We don't know everything that's been how it's been used. We do know that the organisations that it was mostly being done for have really benefited, and you'll hear more about that later.
Great. So our very own Sharon. Hi, Glenn, great session. What happens after the study has concluded? This is a good question. Do the participants maintain a relationship with the researchers?
Yes, actually, this is a really good question. And actually, it's a hard question, because I honestly, I think that by the end of the research, they become good friends, and they really appreciated somebody taking an interest in them. Even after such a long time. So for ethical reasons, they really weren't able to continue the relationship. But we are hoping to be able to do some follow-up research in maybe next year and into the future, because I think that there'd be some really valuable information that we could get from that. So we're hoping that we can we're hoping that some of the mobile phone numbers will still work and we'll be able to reconnect with them. And that's a whole thing in itself, how we've managed to maintain relationship with people. But yeah, I think that's it's been hard both for the researchers and for the participants to finish that relationship, really.
And to add on to that, you know, I know at the end when in the last year that the researchers were doing the interviews, and they went and they met the participants, and they said, you know, this is going to be the last interview. And they said, you know, the participants, many of them were really upset and devastated that it had come to an end. And a number of them have asked to be a part of future research. So obviously, you know, we really adhere to the ethical guidelines around this. So we would not dig back into anybody who does not want to participate. But a number of them said, if you're going to do other research, we would still like to be a part of that. And yes. So yeah, but many of them were very upset when it was coming to the end. They said, yeah, like Glenn said, you know, they had developed a researchers, and some of them said, you know, a lot of them said, I've told you things that I have not told anybody. So yeah. Our next one from Leah. Were the researchers trained in interview methodologies, or did they receive any training over the span of the project?
Yeah, so over the 10-year period, we had 10 researchers who were local Cambodians. Most of them who started with us hadn't really had any training at all. It's very hard to get good training in research methodology, interview technique in Cambodia. So they were trained by the leadership, and one of the things that we had to make absolutely sure of was that none of them had any stigma, or you know, that they really, and that when they were asking questions, they didn't at all come over as being patronizing or stigmatizing. So that was a very vital part of recruiting any of the research team. But yes, all of them, it was it was training as they were working, and it was I mean, it's impressive that at the end of it, we're now talking about 20 different peer-reviewed journal articles that have been written and developed from what really amounts to uneducated research team at the beginning. By the end of it, a number of that team had gone on to do master's degrees, and I wouldn't be surprised if a couple of them ended up doing PhDs as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add one piece to that. I remember one piece of training, because this was, you know, a grassroots NGO ambitiously taking on a longitudinal research with traumatized survivors and with shelter partners. So I always say it's a little bit of a perfect storm, right? But I think one of the things that, in terms of the training, I remember getting to a point where the participants were sharing deeper and deeper information with the researchers, and the researchers were becoming a little bit like counselors. But of course, most of this was happening on the phone. They would get crisis calls saying, you know, I'm considering committing suicide, or I'm having a terrible time, or I'm stuck, or they would get calls saying everything's great. And so actually we did put the researchers through telephone counselling training as well. So there's a helpline in Cambodia that we helped to set up. And so they actually trained the researchers specifically on online counselling and online listening, because there was an aspect of vicarious trauma here, which Glenn is going to go into when we do the research in a few minutes. Oh, Barbara Ann, that is a great question, and I'm going to ask you to copy and paste that after the next session. So Barbara Ann is, what advice would you give to setting up a small longitudinal study of survivors as part of an M&E program? So I'm going to ask you to copy and paste that after the next session, because it'd be very applicable for that. So I'm just going to hold that one. Okay, we've got a few more minutes on this one. How can a program help those that are in debt? Because whenever they newly build that, they may not recover the huge debt they have. So they're still trapped, but the donor won't support debt recovery. That's true. Usually the rehabilitation service is primarily women, clients, and workers. Does the research observe any positives and negatives impact on the victims in their interaction perception with the opposite sex? Well, those are kind of two interesting pieces, right, Glenn? Yeah. So how can programs help those that are in debt, is very, especially as the debt is huge? So that's the first piece, Glenn.
Okay, well, I mean, unfortunately, our research doesn't demonstrate how that happened, how it could help. We're just identifying the problem, unfortunately. So I'm sorry to not be very helpful in my response to that, but I can't say. But yeah, it's. I think what we're really saying is trying to help people so they don't get into that level of debt in the first place.
And I think that you're absolutely right. Donors won't support debt recovery. And I think that, you know, there's been situations in the past where people in a well-meaning way have covered debt to slave owners, and actually the slave owners have actually used that as a form of income. And so there's a whole massive conversation around debt recovery. Then, yes, so then the second part of that is usually the service is primarily towards women. The positive and negative impact on the victims in their interaction with the opposite sex after they're back in the community.
Yeah, I mean, we did look very closely at relationships as they developed, and those that went on to getting a divorce, those who were stigmatized by their partners, and so on. So it's all there. I can't really go into detail at this point, but yes, that we believe that's a very important aspect of how much they can recover in their rehabilitation process as well.
Yeah. And I'll just add one thing to that. Yeah, I think it's the stigma paper. I think it was the stigma paper where it looked at the levels of violence within intimate relationships after they had gotten back into the community, and the levels of violence were extraordinarily high. In fact, I think there were very few that didn't have violent relationships. Okay, our next one. For those participants who turned out not to have been sexually exploited, were the hosting organizations aware of this? No, they weren't. Did the organizations deliberately misrepresent the nature of the client's cases, or did the clients feel the need to misrepresent the nature of their exploitation in order to receive services? It was the latter. We don't believe that any of the aftercare shelters actually knew this. It was a way that, that the participants were trying to prevent themselves from being exploited. Would you agree, Glenn?
Yes, I mean, it's very hard to say definitively that they absolutely didn't for some of the organizations. But like I say, we really tried to we went to some lengths to make sure that they weren't. So I think it was mostly the latter.
Okay, so Jakob, who's interning for us right now, thank you for these valuable insights. And more technical question: how important was statistical significance in terms of your confidence in the findings of this longitudinal study? Were there any concerns about this as the sample size was dropping, or were the qualitative findings convincing enough? Yeah,
another good question. We had to there were some sometimes we did try to do some kind of statistical confidence, but statistical analysis. But most of the time, it was really looking in terms of, well, if, for example, 60% said that they'd experienced violence from their partner, intimate partner, then that was a significant enough finding for us to not to have to think about the detailed statistical significance. So we mostly the research was qualitative. We didn't also when in terms of the results, it's we could only look at the we only had these 128, and then for this for most of the comparative study, we only had 52. So it was a small sample, and so and we couldn't necessarily say that those that we were working with were representative in any way. So it's limited value, I think, to have done more in-depth statistical analysis, but there was some done with some of the peer papers you'll see.
Right, thanks, Glenn. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next section, which is the research on the research. Just before Glenn kind of like digs into this, I just want to talk through a couple of minutes about the importance of the replication of this. So replication is what we need to see in longitudinal research in the counter-trafficking movement around the world. We, at the beginning, we were kind of like proudly saying, oh, Butterfly is the only longitudinal research of its kind. And then after a while, I would say, I feel very sad, actually, that the Butterfly longitudinal research is the only research of its kind in a movement where there are millions of dollars being invested by donors, millions of hours being invested by frontline program staff, but yet we are not seeing longitudinal research to truly understand what is happening over the span of the lives of vulnerable populations and already exploited populations. So we're not just talking about, you have to replicate longitudinal research with survivors of sex trafficking. We're saying the movement needs longitudinal research, whether you're looking at longitudinal research in prevention, whether you're looking at it in aftercare, whatever context it is, we need to understand the longitudinal hopes, fears, constraints, everything that's happening within the movement. If we're not going to be doing this in the longitudinal manner, then in 10 years' time, how much more are we going to know if all we're doing is snapshot research? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing snapshot research. That should be a given as well. But we know that after 3 years of doing this research, as Glenn said, we actually had quite a crisis at the end of 3 years, because people, some of the cohort were answering questions around like basic demographic information that was changing. And one of our donors was saying, have you changed the cohort? What's happened? People were identifying as, like Glenn said, you know, within the ethnic communities, they were identifying as Cambodian. Then after they could trust us, more than 3 years it took, they then started identifying as their actual ethnicity. Now, what does that say about the research? It says that it took 3 years for those participants to get to the point of saying, actually, I can be really honest with you and tell you these things that I haven't told anybody else, because it may, impact my life in a number of different ways. And so we saw this huge shift between year 3 and year 4. And that was when we began digging deeper into the qualitative piece and producing the thematic papers. So yeah, I mean, we've been really encouraged that there have been a number of organizations in Africa, primarily in East Africa, who are trying to see who could roll out longitudinal research. There's been a couple of organizations interested in Thailand on doing a longitudinal research that focuses on the prevention side. We've had some organizations in the Middle East who've also been interested in replicating some type of longitudinal research. And so I think that this is something that we really need to see the movement change as we move into the next phase of the anti-trafficking movement, is longitudinal research. You know, we look at the health sector. They're not going to put anything into anything unless they've got longitudinal research, and we need to be moving in that direction. Okay, I'm going to hand over to you, Glenn, on this next bit.
Okay, so this is a quote from that book, which I think some of you know, by Charlie Mackelsey. What do you think success is? Asked the mole. To love, said the boy. Next one, please. Yeah, I think I just want to add to what Helen said, and one of the most important outcomes of this research is that people understand that doing aftercare isn't something that you do in a few months or a couple of years. It needs to be followed through. So it's not just about the research; it's also about seeing whether your outcomes have been helpful in the long term. It's easy to ask somebody as they're leaving the shelter, how was it for you? They're going to say yes, so it's great. But what about later on when things have settled down, and then as we found, lots of challenging stuff continuing. So even outside of the research, I think that's one of the really important findings. So we did to do research of the research. We did a self-completed online mixed methodology of 14 questions for 37 stakeholders. And then we did a mixed method self-completed online survey for all 10 of the research team members over the years. And then we did a focus group discussion with the research team who were still working at the end of the research period. And we did a survey of 85 Butterfly participants of their experiences doing the research. So those are the main ways in which we did it. Okay, next, please. So you can see here in the stakeholders, we got a number of stakeholders all working in different sectors. Nice, good cross section there. from donor to those involved in case intervention. Right, next please. And when we asked them how useful it had been, the majority said very good or good, so that was encouraging. Next please. Did they feel that their opinions were valued? So a great deal was and a lot was good, but there were still some challenges in trying to, some people felt like their opinions weren't necessarily taken into consideration. So we explored that a bit more. I think, to be honest, a lot of it was where people had been given ability to contribute, but they hadn't always taken that up. But nevertheless, that was significant to hear that, and so we have to think about different ways in which we can involve the stakeholders more in the process. But I think overall pretty good. So sorry, next one. So the responses from the stakeholders. So these are some quotes. I got the opportunity to hear the voices from clients to improve services and internal strengthening capacity to work more effectively for rehabilitation of survivors and reintegration in the community. And another one, I learned about the progress of healing and effectiveness for reintegration. As a counsellor for many years, we're challenged to find the good life for our clients after reintegration. But finally, I learned a lot from the Butterfly Project. We discuss how to support our clients better in the community. Next one, to know what happens to those we serve can be very therapeutic because oftentimes we don't stay in contact with all the clients. And the last one, further realization that often programs fall short of follow-up on support of survivors when they have returned reintegrated, not only on the amount of time, but on the range of support that could have been provided, made accessible. Okay, next. So when we asked the recipients themselves, we asked how they considered responses. How did they feel about doing the research? 2 out of 10 said very positive and 8 out of 10 positive. So that was great. So this is the researchers themselves. When asked if they felt there were times when participants got upset or angry, 3 out of 10 said yes. When asked why this were their responses. So some participants felt that they were forced to join the study at the beginning during the first year of interview and recruited by the organisation because they didn't really understand what they needed why they needed to join in the study. However, in later years, after having a good relationship and trust with the research team, they understood about the research purpose and activity. They started to feel happy and privileged. Our research team tried our best to maintain good relationship with participants, showing them respect and value for their decisions. I tried to explain to them about the purpose of the research. They mostly got angry when we talked about their past experiences. And as I mentioned before, particularly around their experiences with the court system, because that was very difficult for them. Okay, next, please. So when we looked at researchers' opinion on the value of research, these are some of the things. Recommendations from the voice of survivors enhance Chab Dai and partner NGOs' work and bridge a connection between partner NGOs and participants. The research team recognized that we are not the experts. They felt that survivor voice recommendations were very powerful. I think that's really significant response, that they realized that they themselves weren't the experts, but the survivors were. The research enabled Chab Dai to build networking, both local and international stakeholders, and build partnerships to curb, prevent child human trafficking, especially sexual exploitation. Next, please. So challenges of completing the project. 5 out of 10 said the participants were upset the project was ending. 4 out of 10 were the challenges of obtaining funding throughout the project. And I have to give Helen a big shout for that, because that was incredible that she managed to continue to do that all the way through. 3 out of 10 found it difficult getting the papers completed, and it has been. We're still in the process of getting this research into these peer-reviewed journals, and I can tell you, I'm not sure whether I would have done it if you'd have told me how much work it was going to be at the beginning. Anyway, our responses were project team members leaving, not well. Yeah, these were some of the honest answers that some of the researchers gave, that the project team members left, before the project had finished. So that was really hard. They felt that it wasn't very well planned, the way that everything finished. I think it was partly because there was so much work on those who were left behind, and the activity behind the planned schedule. that doing things ethically doesn't allow me to continue in relationship with the participants. That was really painful for one of the researchers, and not enough time to communicate to NGO partners. They won't come to us, but they always appreciate findings, although all involved, but managers less so. So yeah, I think also towards the end of the project, we had, some of the NGOs that hadn't been there in the beginning didn't really understand the value of it, and so it was harder to keep them coming along and being actively involved in it. So that's the honest response from the researchers. Next, please, Helen. How could it have been done better? Well, recruitment of the participants, maybe not allowed selection by the aftercare shelter, the screening of survivors twice before deciding if they fit criteria with suggestion, designing the questionnaire more selective about what questions to include, although I think that's really challenging because you don't know until you know, if you know what I mean. Those of you who've done research will know that. 5 key questions, more open-ended, plus tick box questions would be what they would have liked. When new areas have added, it can make the survey very long. Yes, it did. And it should have done, we maybe should have done in slightly different ways. And we mustn't forget the purpose to inform stakeholders to do better. So they need simple explanation and recommendations for local staff. And the research team needed better training in data analysis, not just management. Critical thinking, report writing skills. Our culture says, don't dare do something new. So that was interesting. I think that that was great. Again, I really appreciated their honesty in their responses and what it can learn for the future for other researchers. Okay, next, please. So these are some of the peer review papers so far. But if you look on the thematic papers, chabdai.org /butterfly, then you can find all the technical reports. And we will be making most of these reports by Cordisco are not available for free, but the research that's being published in a special edition of the Dignity, the journal Dignity, is all open access. So, and we will be making that available on the Chab Dai Butterfly website later. Next, please. So those are the technical papers. Yeah, please find those on the Chab Dai /butterfly website. Next, please. Did it achieve its objectives? Well, yes. Next, Helen. So the first objective was to provide an opportunity for survivors to express their reintegration experiences. And we felt the participants did feel that their voices were heard in an ethical and dignified way. And although a few described the stress and anxiety of answering questions about the legal process, for example, overall this weighed favourably against the enjoyment and appreciation of being listened to and heard and the information received. In fact, it seems to provide a role in follow-up that was not achieved by the aftercare organisations themselves. Next, please. To present their perspectives and experiences to Butterfly NGO partners and other relevant stakeholders. So in interviewing the researchers about and communicating with stakeholders, but many of them felt they had done what they could do to work with stakeholders. Some said that some of the stakeholders became less cooperative, perhaps because they were involved in the early stages were no longer working with stakeholder organisations as the project continued. The research team did admit that in the final stages they found it hard to juggle everything that they needed to do, and they didn't invest as much as they could have done in maintaining relationship with the other NGOs, especially where the relationship was already challenging or fragile. Mostly stakeholders felt that the information they received was useful in the development of programs and policies, although the staff mostly provided opportunities for stakeholders to be involved in the process of the reports. This wasn't always taken up. Okay, next, Helen. So, and then finally, to disseminate the research findings and lessons learned amongst mixed audiences of practitioners and policymakers. So we found that the interviews with stakeholders in which they were asked some questions about whether the research findings found the data and recommendations did provide useful information for them, e.g. for aftercare programs were able to provide better care for survivors, policymakers could improve policy and programs, and researchers could use the information to build on more research information. So in addition to broad lessons learned, specific confidential feedback was provided to partner organisations as needed and requested. So yeah, in addition to the research itself, we actually went back to some of the organizations where children, adults had told us, for example, there was sexual harassment between clients that needed reporting back to the organization, and then they were able to make adjustment in their child protection policy and in their way that they did their practice. So obviously that was information that was confidential about their particular organization, but it was a way in which we could also improve practice. Next, please, Helen. So the future is of significance. A large number of participants were keen that their story was told so that others could benefit from it. Some specifically said that they hoped their story could be read by vulnerable young people, so they're warned about the dangers. And so one of the things that I'm suggested is that we can, to improve the lives of young people, is that we can maybe use some of the data in stories to communicate to vulnerable young people. For example, an illustrated comic book with case studies maintaining confidentiality of participants could be developed in simple to understand Cambodian language and distributed through high schools. And in fact, that recommendation was taken up by OzCam, and they've now produced a cartoon and a flip chart and a comic book, which is going to be used in high schools. So it's of note to remember how stories have successfully been used historically to challenge racism and slavery, child rights, education and poverty. All of those things have been challenged using stories. And so we are very keen that stories can be used. We're exploring currently developing some audios that could be maybe 2-minute audios of some of the key findings that we've had that could be used to challenge boards and others. You know, Chab Dai itself have been very active in promoting ethical storytelling. Okay, thanks, Helen. Okay, so Q&A. Can we have that question that we had before, Helen? I think that was really helpful. You need to unmute. Yes.
So I'm going to go back to your question, Barbara Ann. What advice would you give to setting up a small longitudinal study of survivors as part of an M&E program?
Yes, I mean, as I said before, I think all organisations working in aftercare should have a long-term M&E part of what they're doing, so they can follow survivors. And that means that is going to be costly, because if you're following people after they've been in some kind of aftercare program into the future, then you need people who can do that. But I would strongly recommend you do it. I think ideally it's worked with Chab Dai because you had 15 different organizations that were all collaborating together on this. And I think it would be much better if you could do that, you know, frankly. I think if you can find other NGOs that you could do it with, other aftercare programs that you can do it with, I think it makes it stronger. And you can also support each other as well. So I would definitely recommend that you try to do that. But yeah, if you're interested, then we're here to support you and would be very happy to work with you on that.
Right, thanks. And yeah, just to add to that, you know, at the beginning when the participants were in shelters, the budget was less. Obviously, when they moved to the community, the budget significantly increased because you couldn't just do one focus group with 15 participants. You had to go to 15 places around the country. So, and we did it on a shoestring at 100,000 a year in the last few years, and that was on a shoestring. So there are a lot of, like, you know, financial considerations, but that shouldn't really change this when we see that donors are putting millions into the movement. Okay, John Frame said, could you put the comic books and the other narratives in Khmer online, as many have online access these days? And he means young people. I think they are.
Yeah, John, thank you. it's still in the final process of making them. To be honest, they're literally just, they just sent me the drafts a couple of weeks ago, so I have seen them and I really like them, and I know that there's interest not just in Asia but also in Africa as well. So we will be making that available wider. I told them at the beginning that if we were going to do this, it needed to be replicable and available, but I think it will need a slight tweaking in depending on the context. And what's happened before is that we've done, for example, with the good touch bad touch flip chart, that's now in 4 different it's set in 4 different contexts. So and this one again, I think it would be needed to be different clothing, for example, for different contexts.
Right.
Yeah.
Brian said, I've read most of the thematic studies you've published from the larger study. I really appreciate the information available. Are there any plans for developing theme-specific guides on best practice and practical applications for what was learned in the study?
Yes, that's a good question. I think that those who came to the 2020 evaluation day, when we were presenting some of the findings, we did summarize some of the findings in that, and that is available online. So have a look out for that. I think that you're quite right. In the thematic papers, we didn't always have a very quick way of doing it. But I think one of the challenges with this stuff is that we need to make the effort to read stuff. And I want to challenge the practitioners in particular, that, you know, it's actually really worth looking at stuff, because then rather than just getting the headlines, we're getting the background, which is really important. So I would encourage you to try that. But yes, have a look for that paper in the Chab Dai website.
Right. Lovely. Well, we have 1 minute to go. So I think that I'm going to wrap up our session by saying thank you to the 50 or so people who are on this call who are really seeing the importance of longitudinal research. I really want to put a challenge out to you and say, what are you going to do with this information now? Can you imagine if there was 50 pieces of longitudinal research from the 50 people who are on this call over the next 10 years in the movement? How much more would we understand about the context that we're working in? So I'm going to put that challenge out to you. Speak to donors, speak to policymakers. I think that we need to be longitudinal research evangelists on this. And then just to close, I just want to thank Glenn, who is just phenomenal in, as he says, you know, if he had only known how much hard work it would be. Well, of course, I never told him that, right? I'm just so grateful to Glenn, who has stuck by this research after all of these years. And very much so after losing Siobhan as well, and the fact that Glenn gets to be my friend and on my board as well. So thank you, Glenn, for this amazing roundup today, and thank you everybody for joining. Have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Thank you. Bye.
Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.